Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world joining us today. My name is Jeremy Boy. I'm with the United Nations Development Program, and I'm really excited to be here for this great session entitled Communities and Communications. So we're going to have 6 video presentations. The first one is entitled Chemicals in the Creek, Designing a Situated Data Physicalization of Open Government Data with the Community. It will be presented by Laura Perovich. I hope you enjoy it. Over to the video. Over to you, Laura.
I'm excited to talk to you today about our work designing situated data physicalizations of open government data with the community. I'm Laura Perovich from Northeastern University and MIT, and this work was done with Sara Wylie at Northeastern University and Roseann Bongiovanni at Greenwoods. So over the past few decades, there's been an increase in open government data. This has happened on an international, national, and on a city scale, and includes a number of government agencies sharing their data online. This can look like many things on the ground, but the stated goal is often around increasing transparency and increasing public participation. This raises new questions about what public are we talking about, and second, what is it that we're doing to support their participation with this data? Part of this ties into where do we start in this process? One option is that we can begin with the data. Governments already collect and share a lot of data online, and there's a lot of opportunities to improve or really reimagine some of these websites and experiences. And there's a lot of existing interesting work on this in the information visualization community. The second place we can start is with the public itself. So that means asking questions about what issues people are concerned with and what government data exists out there that speaks to this problem on a community level and can create action and impact on these issues. So our work starts from the second and begins from the community. We take a participatory action research model, which is a method that's been developed over 80 years and has a number of key attributes. First, it often focuses on creating social change, particularly in terms of community impact and action. Another important part of it is that it engages with power structures in its considerations. There's many other details in this process, but because of these in particular, we think it's particularly relevant to the work we're interested in doing on public data. And this participatory action research model fits into some other conversations happening in the information visualization community around design studies and what they can do and what problems they approach. Particularly thinking about wicked problems and some of the social issues we're facing today, and what sort of design studies might be rigorous and also address some of these issues and create new spaces for evaluation and approaches. We think of our project as one application in this space that also offers some new theoretical perspectives, particularly around how participatory action research might be practically added to this conversation. So our participatory action research project began, as I mentioned, with a partnership with a community group, between a community group and researchers. The community collaborator is Green Roots. Green Roots is a community organization in Chelsea, Massachusetts, that works on a number of environmental justice issues in the area. ECO is their high school student group, the Environmental Chelsea Organizers. And they were one of our main partners and collaborators in this process. So the first phase of our research project process was around relationship building and ideation. This was a year-long process where we did a number of exploratory workshops. Some of these workshops included traditional design activities like brainstorming, but one of the main points of this process was really to learn from each other. This meant that we included a number of student-led projects and workshops because what we were working towards was finding a problem, a challenge in the community that we as a group together could bring our shared expertise to researchers and community members. We have a paper that discusses this process in great detail that you can see here, and it's also discussed in our InfoVis paper. Throughout this ideation phase, one big topic surfaced, particularly the impacts of the local oil storage facilities. So there are 7 oil storage facilities near Chelsea on the Chelsea Creek, all of which have permits to discharge pollution into the waterway. The facilities collect this data and share it back with the EPA, a federal agency in the US, and this data is reported online. And this includes data on permit violations made by the industries. What we saw was that this data was of interest to the community because they were concerned with the cumulative impacts of these facilities on the waterway and the community, but it wasn't something that was legible or visible to the community. With some digging, we were able to find that there are 76 violations from these facilities over the course of 5 years, and that these violations happened for a range of parameters, including some carcinogens. So this became the motivating question that our first year of work really led up to, and that inspired the rest of the project. So we wanted to know, how can we make these water quality permit violations visible, understandable, and actionable in the community? So approaching these questions, we leveraged many tools and techniques from the information visualization community, particularly drawing on data physicalization because we wanted broad engagement with this information, and artistic approaches to data display, such as a number of museum exhibits on environmental issues. We also drew from work on public data displays in cities. Considering all these things together, we decided to make a data display of these violations on the Chelsea Creek and to use the metaphor of ceremony. So we would create floating lanterns that represented the violations and that were situated on the creek, which put them in the context of both the polluting organizations, so the oil storage facilities, and also the communities and rivers impacted. Our design process is detailed in our paper and in the supplemental information, but it ended up being that each lantern represented one violation, that the color of the lantern indicated the chemical in violation, the label on the lantern indicated the industry in violation, and we put the lanterns in the water chronologically according to the time of the violation. The final step of our planning and implementation process was building these 76 lanterns together through a series of workshops. This was another embodied and physical way to understand the data and just see how many violations there were. So the chemicals in the creek event itself occurred during a Green Roots community meeting. Everyone met at Green Roots and then walked over the event together, which created a space to build community, which was, again, supported the action aims of the participatory action research process. The event began with an introduction by Green Roots students and researchers in both Spanish and English to meet the needs of everyone in the community. We also shared a brochure including the violation data again, as well as background information. So I'll show a quick short video so you get an idea what this looks like on the ground. So we began by setting up the lanterns, and you can see the oil storage facilities visible in the background there. We organized the lanterns by facility on the docks, and then we began to light up these year signs and call out the years. After each year, people would put the lanterns representing the violations from that year in the water. At the end, community organizers spoke to the group, and people had the opportunity to go touch and interact with the lanterns on the water. After the data display, we went back to Green Roots, where there was a community meeting led by Green Roots that created space for collective reflection on this data and consideration of what sort of actions we might be able to take. So in our paper, we present 7 main findings on our data performance. This includes information on the social experience, the research process, and the role of affect in the data display and the event overall. Here I'll highlight a few findings that were most central for us. First, I want to discuss a few community action outcomes, because these are the most central to participatory action research model, is creating change and impact in the community. So the chemicals in the creek event received local press coverage, which was another way to make this information visible, not only to the attendees, but to the broader community. It also shaped who was able to tell their story about the data. So instead of the industries sharing the information, the community was able to discuss what was important to them about the cumulative impacts of these violations and their potential to impact the broader community. We also saw that the event was effective in changing the conversation between Green Roots and other community groups and the oil storage facilities. The visibility of the data impacted the power relationships between these groups and led to greater accountability by the oil storage facilities. In particular, they began directly reporting violations to Green Roots as well as to the EPA's online data set. And this provided a way for Green Roots to get more information about the violations, to learn about what might have caused them and to ask follow-up questions about what the industries were doing to try and avoid violations. On the research side, we saw the power of the physicality of the data display, in particular in showing the data in the context of the community itself. We also saw that for people who put the lanterns in the water, it was a really impactful and moving experience. And in fact, there are some people who are observing the event who wanted more ways to participate that were hands-on like this. Designing the social experience around the data was also incredibly central, and this, I suspect, is something that it will be common to participatory action research studies and community action projects related to data visualization. So this is something that can be considered in this new model for design studies, making sure that we're designing not only the data display, but the full experience around the display. And in fact, a number of critiques of the event centered on these experiential components. A number of people complained that it was kind of cold that evening, which was definitely true, and mentioned that some aspects of the event could have been better organized. So again, this is a good reminder that it's not only about the data display. We need to craft an event that sparks community connection, that recognizes the emotional aspects of the data and the topics we're discussing, and provides opportunities for participation. So I'll discuss 3 research and design opportunities that we see from the study. So first, we consider this work to be one example of participatory action research model used in a design study. There's a lot of opportunity to further flesh out the theoretical work behind this and create detailed connections between participatory action research and the information visualization community, in particular in the context of this idea of the new model for design studies. And this includes also fleshing out some evaluation approaches that are discussed in other papers. We also see an opportunity for more work around performance and ceremony and information visualization. This builds on the extensive work that already exists using the visual arts as a way to convey data, and that we see there's space for more partnerships with groups like with fields such as theater and dance. Finally, some of the key themes that emerged in our process were issues of power and the importance of embodying the data and the information. This overlaps with recent work in data feminism, so we see a space here to engage more with this theoretical work and create these connections. So we hope you'll see our paper for more information on our process and our findings, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you.
Thanks, Laura, for this great project and very interesting presentation. I see quite a bit of praise in the chat, some big claps, since we can't hear people clapping. We do already have a series of questions coming in that came in throughout the session. So I see at least a couple coming from Petra Eisenberg, maybe even a third one just came in. From INRIA, there's one from Mariah Mayer from the University of Utah. Maybe we'll take a couple of Petra's questions in order, and then we'll take Mariah's question. So the first one, to what degree did it matter to the audience to understand the encodings? Like to have a legend at hand?
Yeah, so I'll note first that the people's understanding of the data wasn't something that we intentionally measured here because we were really focused on the community outcomes. But from sort of observations and more casual conversations with people, I would note that there's sort of different layers of messages that people got. So my sense was that everyone understood that each lantern was a violation. And then throughout the crowd, some people understood the coding of the colors representing different chemicals. Everyone also understood that the industries, because they were very familiar with industries in the area, and that was sort of clearly labeled on the lantern, and the timing was something that was understood broadly as well, is my best guess. We did try and make the messages really redundant, so folks had a brochure where the data encoding was also listed, so they could refer to it there. And there was this interesting arc of the display where folks saw it first with some explanation on the docs, but then we went back and talked about it. And again, my sense is that a lot of people put together more pieces during that community meeting after.
Great, thank you. The follow-up question here, also related, I guess, to encoding. Did you consider encoding the long-term impact of the pollutants? So in case there are some that stay in the water for longer than others?
Yeah, that was something we were really interested in the beginning. What we ran into was just the complication of understanding on how all the different things impact on that particular system. So some of the chemicals that were in violation were more toxic than others. They also had varying amounts. At the same time, each chemical can affect different parts of the system differently. There's also the tides to consider and the sort of exposures to other things in the environment that might mediate some of the effects. So untangling the sort of toxicological impacts of each of the chemicals wasn't something that was sort of within the scope of our project, though it was something that we were interested in.
Sure, understandably. Thank you. Last question, so from Mariah. She loves the idea that that the visualizations facilitated conversations. Did you try to document these conversations? Do you have ideas of how to assess this type of impact visualization can have?
Yeah, so we really spent a lot of time following up and maintaining the relationship with Green Roots afterwards. That was a great way to get more information about what the event meant to the community and some of the outcomes in terms of the relationship with the industries, which was really central and interesting to us. In terms of the conversations at the event, the post-it note activities was the one more formalized way that we documented information. We didn't want to record the conversations just because that was sort of not standard practice for Green Roots in their community meetings, and we wanted to like respect their community practices. And we also, because it was a more sensitive conversation, we wanted people to feel really comfortable discussing those things without worrying about that aspect. At the same time, it would have been great to have like more details there and find a way to capture those conversations that is more comfortable to people. So that could be something we think about later on. And I think it's a question for lots of folks doing this socially engaged kind of research.
Sure. Great. Thank you for these interesting answers. I think what I really like about this work, and it's kind of true for all the following papers as well, is that it's extremely situated. And indeed, as you just mentioned, it's like taking in the codes of the communities that you're actually interacting with. It's not coming from the outside and imposing something, it's really developing with them. So thanks a lot again for this presentation, for your work. We'll move on to the second presentation by Elaine Huynh. I hope I pronounced that right. Designing narrative-focused role-playing games for visualization literacy in young children. Over to you, Elaine.
Hello, I'm Elaine Huynh, and I'm excited to present our work on leveraging stories and role-playing games as a support for visualization literacy development on behalf of my colleagues at the University of Toronto. As most of us are aware, there is a lot of data. More importantly, data that is critical to our understanding of the world around us. Take a look at the COVID-19 situation. We don't have to look too far to see how much it's affected us. This presentation would have been delivered in person if not for it, for starters. We also don't have to look too far to see how much data has been generated as a result of it. In order to navigate and make sense of all of this information, proper visualization literacy skills are needed. Unfortunately, such skills are sometimes overlooked, and literacy rates amongst the general public are poor. But where or how do we develop such skills? School children are exposed to charts and data management as early as grade 1. But the amount of tools available to support visualization education is quite low when compared to other topics like addition or multiplication. The visualization community has recently started to address this with standardized tools and tests for measuring visualization literacy, frameworks to guide development of curricula and assessment, as well as ways of supporting learning within the classroom. After seeing what other fields have done, we saw an opportunity to leverage games as a way of supporting learning of visualizations. In many of these games, players learn through repetitive gameplay mechanics, honing memorization and recall skills. For example, a game about multiplication may require you to answer questions over and over again, and the gamification comes from receiving points or some sort of reward based on your performance, or perhaps even how quickly you answered them. We saw that not much has been done to gamify visualization education, and on top of that, these gamification methods may not apply well to the field. In examining worksheets and various curricula related to visualizations, we noticed heavy usage of word problems. In these problems, some descriptive text is provided to give context or motivation for questions. This narrative aspect is often overlooked in the types of games previously described, but we see an opportunity to use this to our advantage and apply a more narrative-focused approach to game design, as seen in role-playing games or RPGs. That said, not much has been done in seeing how RPGs can be used in educational games in general, and definitely not in games focused on visualizations. Moreover, whether or not a more narrative-focused approach is actually beneficial remains to be seen. This brings us to our main research questions. First, what are the key factors to consider for an RPG-style educational game, specifically one targeting visualization literacy? And second, how does the inclusion of narrative elements affect learning and engagement in the context of such a game? As part of our work, we created a short visualization-focused game to act as a tech probe. Here's what a traditional non-story-based game might look like. Here we have a problem. To make it a bit more visually interesting, we've thrown in some pretty pictures and animated characters. We solve the problem and another problem shows up. Solve that one, get another one, so on and so forth. It's pretty, but it's really just a sequence of unrelated or disconnected puzzles. To elevate it a bit, let's see how the usage of RPG elements and the inclusion of a world and narrative help to tie the puzzles together, and more importantly, give purpose and motivation to the educational content. Imagine I'm a kid. I started the game and I'm greeted with character and some dialogue, giving me an idea of what's going on and what I need to do. Once the dialogue ends, I know it's my turn to move around and get her to wherever she needs to go. So I tap around to move to other areas and explore the game world in a sense. Once I get to my next objective, I'm greeted with more dialogue and eventually some educational content. This puzzle is the same as what was seen in the previous version, but we're given more motivation and context behind what we're doing. If I'm invested in the narrative, I'll want to complete the puzzles to see more of it. To evaluate our designs, we performed a between-subject study with 33 children between 11 to 13 years old. 16 children were given the version of the game with no narrative elements, just puzzles, while 17 were given the version with narrative elements. In other words, the puzzles, the dialogue, and exploration. Each study occurred independently of one another, and consisted of a pre-test, playtime, post-test, and interview. Time spent in each phase was similar between the two conditions, except in the playtime phase. This is because both versions of the games had the exact same set of puzzles to answer, but participants in the with narrative condition also had to spend time on the dialogue and exploration. When looking at just time spent on the puzzles, it was roughly the same across both conditions. With respect to learning, we saw no significant differences in pre- and post-test scores at first glance. But examining based on demographic groups did reveal some improvements based on factors such as age and gender. Both qualitative and quantitative data also showed that the game is better for teaching or introducing new concepts, rather than reinforcing understanding of previously acquired skills. More thorough findings can be found in the paper. Engagement, on the other hand, was found to be significantly better amongst participants exposed to the full version of the game, the one with narrative elements. Some children given the version with no narrative elements even stated that they would have liked to see a story unprompted. So, to answer one of our research questions, although children had to expend more time and effort in the with narrative condition, the inclusion of such elements heightened engagement and overall enjoyment, without sacrificing any of the educational value or learning. Onto the other research question. In our paper, we contribute an overview of important factors for designers to consider in their own development of educational games for visualization literacy. I'll briefly go over a few of them, and you can see the paper for more. The choice of your target audience carries high implications on what you can present in your game. Children are exposed to visualizations early on, but differences in topics covered arise based on factors such as grade and location. For example, children in France, Ontario, and various states are expected to start learning about data management in grade 1, but students in Manitoba begin in grade 2. In France, the curriculum mentions scatter plots and histograms as early as grades 3 and 4 respectively, whereas children from Ontario aren't expected to understand them until the end of grade 8. It's important to understand how visualization is taught at various ages and locations, so as to not make false assumptions about what children already know, and to inform designs on what educational content should be covered. In addition, given the narrative-focused approach, you have to consider the reading comprehension skills required to sit through and read all of the text. This could impact other factors such as whether or not you want to add voiceovers to your game, as younger audiences may benefit more from having someone read to them. When dealing with educational games, the design of the educational activities and questions is obviously quite important. Our own game used a multiple choice format in order to address a breadth of topics, but there are many other ways of approaching it. Solving problems related to visualizations encompasses a variety of activities, such as data collection, thinking critically about content, and ultimately how to communicate our findings. If you want to target data collection, maybe the gameplay could focus more on character interactions by having the player survey characters in the game world. In any case, designers have to be aware of factors such as answer validation. Multiple choice answers are very easy to automatically validate, but long answer questions may require support for human validation in the game, or even the usage of NLP techniques. When it comes to the narrative design, what sort of narrative model do you want to go with? Should it be linear for easier control over experiments, or give players more freedom through branching storylines? How about characters? RPGs tend to have antagonists. When coming up with our own game, we thought about the possibility of having characters with nefarious intentions, trying to mislead players into performing typical errors as a way of developing critical thinking. And of course, there's the game itself. Collaborative learning is something that's been looked at, and could be supported by adding some multiplayer aspects to the game. Regarding feedback, how much should you provide, when should you provide it, and how? Is it important to include exploration in your game? Perhaps if you want players to interact and explore data, you might want to look at ways to incorporate exploration in a more playful way. These are all avenues for further research. Many of the design considerations previously mentioned could be applied to fields beyond visualizations, but we also note ways in which game design and visualizations affect each other specifically. The design of our probe was driven largely by the learning objectives we covered. For us, that was chart reading and interpretation. The multiple choice setup allowed us to quickly and robustly address a variety of topics, but consider cases where designers might want to focus on visualization construction or exploration of data. The gameplay would have to accommodate such activities seamlessly, seeking inspiration from mechanics found in existing games wherever possible. We brainstormed many gameplay options before fleshing out the learning objectives, and found that approach actually constrained activity design, limiting the potential educational value of the game. As such, we recommend designers to first focus on activities independent of game mechanics and visual design, as we believe one of the main dangers in designing such a game is to focus more on play rather than learning. This relationship between visualization and game design is certainly not unidirectional. The design of the game also shapes the visualizations. What I mean is that designers might see a need to actually step away from previously established best practices in order to better assimilate charts and other such assets within their game. For example, certain color schemes which work well in typical settings may clash with what's used in the game, and the usage of sharp graphics as opposed to sketchy graphics may not blend well with the general aesthetic of the game. This clear distinction between fun and serious assets could break player immersion within the game environment, impacting their learning and engagement. In closing, we made a first attempt at applying an RPG design to visualization education. From the study involving our game, we found that the effect of narratives on learning were lukewarm, but the effect on engagement was promising. We also identified a variety of design considerations, and in answering our own questions, came across many more areas for future work to touch upon. We're excited to see future work in the area and hope our contributions will help guide such research. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine, for this very interesting project and for the great presentation. I see a lot of positive feedback in the chat, even some suggestions of where to go find funding to continue this kind of research. So probably something to follow up on. I see there are a series of questions from Wolfgang Eigner from the Institute of Creative Media and Technologies at the St. Pauli University. Maybe we can take those in kind of a bulk. The first one, I believe, is somewhat answered in the chat, but is related to the age group you were targeting. So maybe you want to say a few words on that, and then were specific classes targeted supported? So it's like math class, history classes, physics classes, and were children using the tool as part of their class with the teachers, or was this done in more lab settings?
Great. Okay. Thank you for the feedback and for all the questions. So to answer the question about the age groups, we targeted children between 11 to 13 years old. And we reason about it in our paper, but basically we chose them because we thought that they'd be able to sit through a narrative game without having too much intervention from the investigators. For specific classes, we just chose students between the age group, and then we only asked them questions about graphs specifically. So there would always be two different types of questions. It would always be like, here's a scenario, what type of graph would you use for it? And then afterwards you would have a follow-up question about the graph that you chose, and you have to pick or provide a reasoning for why you chose that graph. And then what was the third question again? Sorry.
The third one was were children using the tool as part of their class? So was this embedded in, yeah.
Okay, so the children were not using it in their classrooms. We invited them to private lab sessions, and it was a one-on-one activity. So children didn't see each other, and they were basically just left there to play the game on their own. If they had important questions or needed clarification on anything, they could ask me, and we would try our best. But most of the children just sat through it without much help. They didn't need much guidance at all.
Great, thank you. I see a lot more claps and praise in the chat. There is another question from Petra, but I'm sorry, because of time, we might have to move on to the next presentation.
Yeah, no
so
worries.
I'll invite you to go and answer Petra's question maybe directly in Discord.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Moving on to the third presentation given by Keshav Dasu. I hope again I'm saying that right. Sea of Genes, a reflection on visualizing metagenomic data for museums. Over to you, Keshav.
My name is Keshav Dasu, and I'm a graduate student at UC Davis, and I will be presenting our work, Sea of Genes, a reflection on visualizing metagenomic data for museums. Sea of Genes is a highly collaborative attempt to design an interactive museum exhibit. The exhibit needed to convey findings from the emerging field of metagenomics. We see previous exhibits and visualizations have presented findings from complex datasets to the public. However, these projects visualize concepts that are familiar to the public. This work discusses the challenges of creating a museum exhibit that presents complex content from an unfamiliar domain in a museum setting. So what is metagenomics? We can think of metagenomics as using genetic material to identify what microbes are present and what they are doing. To create an experience around such a data set, we worked with scientists to 1. synthesize their research into a narrative comprised of 3 stories, and 2, apply techniques from established narrative frameworks to layer those 3 stories into a cohesive narrative. Many visualization researchers have analyzed and designed a number of methodologies and frameworks to apply narrative techniques. For example, we can see how narratives enable complex information to be comprehended quickly by the user, or how omission techniques can be used for simplifying complex data, or even understand the process for extracting stories from data and how setting and device choice influence the presentation of a story. We needed to convey the following 3 stories to museum visitors. The first story was microbial interactions occur in a predictable daily rhythm. Second story was genes turn on and off according to a daily rhythm. And lastly, scientists collect data about the genes of microbes to make sense of the temporal patterns in microbial functions. These stories were the synthesis of our scientific partners' research, and taken together could provide the public an understanding of how marine microbes are studied and what they do. How we present these stories, however, is constrained by the considerations of an informal learning environment in an interactive science museum. Each of these considerations was informed by our collaborators at the Exploratorium. The first constraint is a free choice learning environment. Experiences in a museum, as compared to the formal setting of a classroom, are motivated and guided by personal interests rather than compulsory requirements. Therefore, the exhibit design must consider methods to attract and retain visitor attention. The second constraint is public comprehension. Since our museum attracts a diverse audience, we do not know where on the spectrum from novice to expert a visitor's prior knowledge is. Constraint 3, readily decipherable. There is a need for fast decoding and ready interpretation of the visualization. Visitors have a short dwell time at exhibits, and within this time they need to decode what is visually presented. Our design should thus accelerate this decode process. And lastly, support multi-user interaction. Exhibit design must allow for multiple visitors to view or interact. This comes from the need to support social groups who frequent the museum and facilitate collaborative learning. Prior to Prototype 1, a combination of prior studies and referencing the next generation science standards informed us that most visitors would refer to microbes by a role rather than taxonomic classification. So we selected relevant microbes based on their roles to aid familiarity with visitors.
This prototype focused on sharing the first story on microbial interactions. It had 4 microbes that would interact with one another in a central animation. Each microbe had a card on the side of the table that visitors could tap on and add more of that microbe to the community. Here we have a sped up clip of one cycle of the animation, which simulates a 24-hour period. We see microbes in the center interacting and exhibiting different actions. To prevent too much clutter, some of the microbes will drift off the screen while others will die off.
For the evaluation of Prototype 1 and 2, an evaluator would stand near the exhibit and ask every third person as they walk by if they could play with the exhibit. When participants were done, the evaluator would ask the visitor who played the most out of the group a set of questions to gauge usability and comprehension. The first prototype seemed promising, seeing as over 55% mentioned an interaction between microbes, with some naming a specific interaction shown in the animation. So they were able to grasp the first aspect of our story 1, which was microbial interactions occur in a predictable daily rhythm. However, a lot of visitors had difficulties with the exhibit. It was clear from the evaluation that we needed to improve how we portrayed our microbes to make clearer the interactions of interest and focus visitor attention. Going into Prototype 2, we made the following changes, which we can see in this clip.
The second prototype reduced the number of microbes to make it easier to see their unique animations and actions. The microbes now had sprites and detailed animations rather than icons. The cards were updated to describe each microbe as well as provide a timeline to show when their actions would occur. Visitors could touch on the pool of microbes to add them to the community. Annotations were added to direct visitors' attention to microbial behaviors as well as reinforce what time of day they occurred. Side panels were added to provide additional information on how scientists study microbes.
Our findings from this evaluation showed that a majority understood the first story on microbial interactions. These results suggest that the first story depicted in the central animation was communicated clearer through the use of improved assets and anthropomorphized annotations. For our next version, we sought to further improve how we convey Story 2 and Story 3. Specifically, we need to better highlight the underlying metagenomics data.
Prototype 3 focused on showing that the actions the microbes exhibited were driven by genomic expression. A clock was added to the top right of the exhibit. Annotations had a helix symbol to help reinforce that the action was driven by genes and would pop up when a visitor tapped on a microbe. A radial histogram to show the link between the animated action and the genes was added to the card. To create this histogram, the transcripts were functionally annotated and patterns of sequential function were grouped into high-level categories. For example, genes involved in preparing for cell division and then the genes involved in the actual division. The time of expression and the length of the bar were determined by the time of day the sample was collected and the normalized amount of transcript in the sample. If a visitor tapped the card, it would show the histogram inside all of the microbes to help illustrate these are linked together. A simplified panel was added to explain how scientists collect and analyze metagenomic data.
Prototype 3 was evaluated as part of a larger summative evaluation conducted by an external museum evaluation group. Interviews indicated that visitors could not figure out what to do or where to begin and were often confused. Despite our best efforts to design the exhibit to emphasize Story 2 and Story 3, visitors were still extremely confused by what was presented. All of the enhancements seemed to either lead to confusions or bring attention to Story 1. Overall, we were unable to communicate all three of our desired stories. We were able to communicate our first story, but had limited success with the other two. At the time of development, we studied the available narrative frameworks to identify concepts relevant for our work. However, we found limited research that met such an intersection and applied what we could, and we had some success. Reflecting on our overall experience, we now offer some insights into the intersection of narrative visualization and museum design. So, referring back to the storytelling frameworks and structures, Siegel and here presented a set of structures for balancing designer-driven versus visitor-driven narratives, namely martini glass, interactive presentation, and drill down. More recently, Stopel et al. Provided an updated discussion on narrative visualization strategies with focus on systems with an author-driven predefined narrative. Now, these structures have been applied and shown to be effective in a variety of situations. However, testing these structures and developing frameworks and methodologies that cater towards visitor-driven would aid the museum community. Most analysis has been done on settings like online journalism, where the user does not have distractions or free choice. Visitors need to be engaged, and with other settings like the exploratorium, exhibits need to support interaction and multiple users. There is a clear need to aid exhibit designers through further exploration and research into this space. So to begin with the martini glass structure, this structure allows for directing visitor attention directly to a set of points before releasing them with an understanding to explore and make inferences for themselves. However, it's difficult to assume they will get past the designer-driven direct messaging and reach the exploration part. Furthermore, if new visitors are joining the exhibit while it's in the exploration state, they will have missed the direct messaging and lack key information that allows them to participate with the exhibit. The next structure, the interactive presentation, allows for an individual to progress through the story when they are ready to do so, and allows them to repeat steps. The structure, however, does not allow for multiple people to follow along, in the sense of allowing any visitor to step forward and backwards could disrupt another visitor's experience. This constraint could be addressed by transforming this presentation into a looped animation. However, even with using a looped animation, as the animation advances, new information is continuously presented, which we see in Prototype 3 can lead to either confusion or frustration with the exhibit. Finally, we have the drill down structure, which allows for telling multiple related stories, since it is built on drilling into sub-stories and adding new details. However, there is a delicate balance to presenting either new visualizations or materials in the subviews without overwhelming a visitor with the content. Also, we have to prevent visitors from interfering with one another while they drill down, which is another thing to consider in the design. Depending on the relationships between stories, this structure may struggle since it requires a central story to reach all the other sub-stories. Treating stories as graphs and documenting what kinds of graphs each of these structures can present under C1 through 4 is a direction that could merit great value for presenting stories or scientific findings in such conditions. Reflecting on this endeavor, we find there is space for further research at the intersection of storytelling, data visualization, and informal learning. The process of communicating scientific findings as multiple stories visually in an informal learning environment brought many challenges. If the abstraction was too simple, they didn't understand or notice the science. When the science was emphasized, they were confused. Communicating multiple related stories is another challenge, and one takeaway for ourselves going forward is to ensure that the connections between each story are reflected visually. Overall, this study supports retrospective analysis of design work in new cross-disciplinary domains, even if the desired goals were not met. Theories are typically shown to work in their documented space. However, there is value in reporting how these theories behave when tested outside of these documented spaces. We hope our extensive case study will stimulate additional research and approaches for visualizing complex data from unfamiliar domains for the public to explore in physical settings such as museums and visitor centers. Thank you for watching, and please refer to the paper for more detail.
Thank you very much, Keshav, for this really great project. It's really exciting to see work in the context in which it's designed for, and having it designed, again, with people within that context, similar to the first presentation we had. We have a couple of questions in the chat and an ongoing conversation about metrics that I think would be really interesting to address, but I don't think we'll have time, unfortunately. One of the questions is from Niklas Runberg. There were background music in the demos. Was this only background music, or was the sound affected by or related to the information visualized? And if the music was just background music, didn't you miss a great opportunity to provide more information and narrative elements?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The background music was just for the presentation. We didn't include any music for the exhibits on the floor of the Exploratorium, primarily since it's quite noisy in the actual museum setting, so those don't really translate. And there's a lot of exhibits near each other, so there kind of would be a lot of noise inference, so we didn't feel like adding it would really be helpful in this situation. It could be, but at least for our current setting, adding background music, I don't think would really convey or help with the project.
Yeah, I think there's something that would be really interesting to explore there, and sort of both multimodal but also multi-device. Like if you have headphones for audio guides and stuff like that, maybe you can interact with the display. Thoughts for future work, I guess. But
oh, definitely. I think you could create some pretty interesting experiences, especially taking advantage of personal devices that visitors come into a museum with. So that could be something to look into.
For sure. Thanks. We might quickly take the second question from Wolfgang. Prototype 2 seemed quite cluttered with a lot of UI elements. Was that an issue in the evaluation?
Not exactly. I think it definitely had some factors. The table that was put on is a 65-inch 3M touch table. So when it's on the table, it doesn't look as cluttered as it may have looked in the prototype. I mean, in the demonstration. But we did, as we noticed from prototype 2 to 3, we kind of removed this orientation, because in prototype 2, we want people to come from all sides of the table to be able to add microbes and support more participation, which meant that if you're on one side, the annotations and the other descriptions can be readable from like the top side, and if you're on the bottom side, but we felt that was too much decoding for a visitor to do, and let alone try to understand all of our stories. So we said, let's, as you saw, simplify that, since that is maybe too much noise or too much information we're trying to put on the visitors. That's not important to the messaging we want to communicate.
Sure, makes sense, yeah. Well, thanks again for the really great work and the very interesting presentation. I really would encourage you to go into the chat and look at all the comments and praise that there is there as well, and also this whole conversation. I think that's transversal to all of the presentations that we will see on evaluation metrics, if we indeed decide to call them metrics or something else. Thanks a lot. We'll move on now to the next presentation, which will be given by Eytan Adar, and it's communicative visualizations as a learning problem. Over to you, Eytan.
Hi, I'm Eytan Adar, a faculty member at the University of Michigan. It's my pleasure to describe this joint work with Elsie Lee. The general problem we're tackling today is the lack of conceptual tools by which communicative visualizations can be designed and evaluated. Communicative visualizations are a prevalent type of visualization, and examples range from simple charts in scientific articles to sophisticated interactive examples in online newspapers. The specific problem is one of intent, or even more specifically, that we are failing to account for design intent in design and visualization. Without doing this, we can't know if one design is good, or even if one design is better than the other. Cognitive efficiency frameworks for evaluation can't really help us here. They often imply that if someone decoded the visualization correctly, we should be happy. But clearly this isn't the case. No one intends for their communicative visualizations to go in one ear and out the other. Instead, we argue that the designer wants to have some kind of cognitive impact in the viewer. Our proposal is that communicative visualizations should be viewed from an educational lens. The designer is an instructor and the viewer a student. This has a number of benefits. First, it allows us to describe a wide range of cognitive impacts a design visualization can have. These range from being able to remember something to being able to execute some process. Second, it lets us acknowledge the power differential inherent in communicative visualizations. And finally, the kind of learning objectives we focus on are naturally tied to assessments. A learning objective framework takes the form of viewer will be able to verb now. Verbs here come from cognitive dimensions like recall and calculate. Nouns are specific to whatever range of information we want the viewer to learn. The amount of unemployment, the performance of our algorithm relative to others, the process for deciding on a course of treatment. And these are not the in-the-moment kinds of objectives that only exist when the visualization is viewed. Viewing communicative visualizations through a learning objective lens lets us argue about the skills and memories that should persist for the viewer. So to summarize the rest of this in terms of learning objectives, let me say that after watching this talk, the viewer will describe how communicative visualizations are like a teacher-student relationship, describe the limitation of current frameworks, apply the objectives framework to critique communicative visualizations, and identify how designers might be able to leverage the learning objectives approach. I don't have time to address all the related work, but I'll point out that many existing task and evaluation taxonomies have really struggled to find work on evaluating communicative visualizations. In a couple of large meta-studies on evaluation on the order of 800 papers, there's barely any mention of communicative visualizations, 4 times in one and 0 in the other. While there are amazingly rich task taxonomies for each sub-area of visualization, networks, trees, text, somehow all communicative visualization gets lumped together. Much of the advice we find on how to design good communicative visualizations borrows broadly from the visualization literature, but these guides rarely find a way to connect to the designer's intent. What's interesting is that we've actually started to apply the strategies of good teaching, things like storytelling or draw your own, to visualization design. What we're suggesting is that learning objectives can help connect the dots between what we want to teach and how we should do it. I'll end with this one last point about communicative theories of visualization. Both the process-focused approaches, things like Shannon and Weaver's model, and the meaning-focused, the semiology-semiotics camp, tell us about how communication happens. Unfortunately, none go so far as to help us model and evaluate intent relative to design. Eytan gets closest by acknowledging that the goal of communicative visualizations is to provide memorizable information, but even that falls short of the breadth of intents. Before we continue, I want to address our choice of language, designer and viewer. Our working assumption is that communicative visualizations, unlike so-called exploratory visualizations, have 2 parties involved. Our designer stands in for any number of people, scientists, journalists, policymakers. The designer here has disproportionate power. While a good designer might use a user-centered approach in defining their intent, this isn't required by our framework. Being able to identify the designer's intent explicitly will help us determine if it matches the viewer's needs. In trying to find a starting point for learning objectives, we looked at a number of frameworks ranging from Bloom to Structure of Observed Learning Outcomes, or SOLO, to the Data Information Knowledge Wisdom, or DIKW framework. I'll point you at our paper if you want to know more about these. But ultimately, what we decided on is what is known as the revised Bloom taxonomy. It's one of the better studied frameworks, with clear assessments, and really supports the kind of language we want. The revised Bloom is basically this grid structure with verbs on one dimension and nouns on the other. It's intended to be hierarchical, with both nouns and verbs getting more complex, but whether that's true or not will leave to another talk. The verb dimension has 6 main categories that go from to remember, to understand, to apply, to analyze, and finally to create. Each of these have subcategories and example verbs we can use. So the understand category has subcategories including interpret, exemplify, summarize, infer, and so on. For each verb, we might also have synonyms, so like generalize and abstract. The noun dimension has 4 main categories: factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive. As you'll see in a second, while we use the verbs directly, the nouns are replaced with specific examples. Again, each of these knowledge dimensions has subcategories. For example, we might distinguish terminology and specific details under the factual knowledge category. To create a learning objective, we pick a noun and verb dimension. For example, let's take this example of the Phillips curve, a kind of economic model from The Economist. Here I might say, the viewer will be able to recall that low unemployment is associated with high inflation. Or in this example from Wikipedia's article on the Babesia's life cycle, I might say that the viewer will be able to paraphrase the key stages of the parasite's development. At the layer of analysis, we might have learning objectives that require the integration of a number of lower-level insights. For example, this visualization on architecture and justice may have the objective, viewers will be able to contrast the indicators and identify the disproportionate impact of justice on some communities. At the critique layer, an example might be Jon Snow's ghost map, where the intent might be described as, the viewer will critique the hypothesis that cholera is airborne, or judge as accurate the model of cholera is waterborne. Notice that the nouns we work with don't have to be simple insights or ideas. They can include conceptual knowledge. For example, in this interactive visualization from the Financial Times on climate change, we might intend for the viewer to analyze the impact of different policy bundles on global temperature. Or in this example, from a medical guide for nurses, we might say things like, the viewer will be able to apply an algorithm for making a medical decision in an emergency room. It is also worth saying that many visualizations have multiple objectives. That is, we can have multiple intents when we communicate. In our Phillips curve example, we might also say that we want the viewer to summarize over which time period the correlation between unemployment and inflation vanished. Because of the pseudo-hierarchical nature of the framework, we can also upgrade or downgrade objectives. We can replace a simple "will be able to classify" to "will be able to generate hypotheses." The designer can dial in the appropriate learning objective. In part, this might be done to accommodate different kinds of viewers. I don't have time to go through all the combinations, but I'll point you at the paper in our website. We used examples from the Siegel and Hare storytelling paper and the Hullman and Diakopoulos rhetoric work. Where we couldn't find an example for the taxonomy in those papers, we added our own. Now, it's probably obvious that some combinations are more or less likely. It's hard to imagine that we intend for one visualization to allow you to create a metacognitive framework of racial biases. Many higher-order objectives likely require many visualizations or even a full textbook. That said, we were still curious if our framework actually mapped to what communicative visualization designers actually did or thought. To test this, we ran a survey with members of the Data Visualization Society. We specifically targeted those who were in the process of building visualizations and were sharing the work in progress. We used these visualizations to create a short 3-question personalized survey where we provided example objectives for the visualization. Respondents could indicate whether any of our given learning objectives were really their intent, but could also add their own. So here's a sample visualization from one of our participants. One objective we suggested was, the viewer will recall that all 5 major pageants have Black title holders in 2019. Here's a heat map reflecting the distribution of the learning objectives in our survey. After sending out 34 surveys, we collected 132 objectives from 29 participants. The distribution of their learning objectives in the taxonomy grid was very similar to ours, but you can see the tendency towards the upper left or more simple intents. 16 of our participants also agreed to a follow-up interview. We talked to each for 30 minutes, trying to understand their design process and their thinking about their specific visualization. I'll point you at the paper for the full story, but we'll point out some highlights here. First, 15 agreed that learning objectives were helpful or useful for their thinking about their designs. One participant said, in your survey, you were like, what do you want people to take away from this? I hadn't really thought about it. The other thing I wanted people to take away was this insight, so I was like, okay, I'll make that more prominent this time. Our participants also reflected that creating learning objectives was hard, As one participant succinctly put it, I think it's a useful way to think about it, but it's hard as well. This is something that we know is true from the education literature and something we want to explore in the future. Participants also highlighted things that were not really cognitive objectives. They wanted people to feel or engage, and this points to the limitation of the cognitive dimensions. On our site, you can see the start of an affective taxonomy. This framework includes verbs like receives, responds, and behaves, and nouns that focus on opinions, attitudes, and values. We think that this extended taxonomy might help us evaluate visualizations that have clear or hidden affective intents. For business objectives, we'll argue that ideas like engagement aren't really communicative intents. While they might be a proxy for learning, there are better ways to measure learning outcomes. They can also be viewed as side effects and can be measured as things like time on site. Just to wrap up, I'll mention a few areas of ongoing work. First, we think that the learning taxonomy framework is useful for visualization pedagogy. We've used this approach in our classes and anecdotally find that students change their designs once forced to think about the intents. Second, an interesting side effect of defining learning objectives is we can also define a set of things we don't want people to learn. For example, if we're trying to create a politically neutral visualization, we can use anti-learning objectives, the viewer will not, as a way of describing our objectives. Finally, let me briefly mention assessment. We've alluded to the usefulness of learning objectives in creating assessments, and one thing we're currently focused on is how to generate the right way of testing to see if a learning objective is achieved. Thankfully, we have a broad literature to draw on from the education community, which can help us transform objectives into multiple choice and open-ended tests. For example, we might take our objective around unemployment and inflation and ask, in which of the following periods did correlation vanish between unemployment and inflation? A, 1980 to 1990, B, 1991 to 2000, or C, 2001 to 2010? We can ask this question before the viewer sees the visualization to find a baseline, during the viewing to judge readability, and after to judge recall. The goal here is to get an understanding of what's called the program effect. Did the visualization help us achieve the learning objective across the population of viewers? Whether running the actual assessment on real readers is needed is an open question. It's possible that simply thinking about it is sufficient. It's also an open area of research if we can exclusively use multiple choice questions or need to resort to constructed response or open-ended questions, where we might also need to define a rubric. To wrap up, I'll point you again at our paper and website for full details and all our examples. Our website actually lets you play with different framing of objectives to find the best fit. Hopefully I've achieved my learning objective here, and you can now describe how this framework allows us to better understand, build, teach, and evaluate communicative visualizations. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Eytan. This is really, really interesting. A lot of comments in the chat also on the presentation style in your video. I think it's really great to flip the main focus on the slides or on the images that you want to share and have it rather on the presenter. Very nice touch, very much appreciated, I think, in the chat. We have a question coming in from Alex Kale. Can we incorporate elicitation of the designer's intended learning objectives into visualization authoring systems? What are the challenges in trying to do so?
Yeah, I think that's doable. That's a great question. I think it is doable. Certainly in asking people what their intents are, in automated or semi-automated tools, one can create alternatives that then can be evaluated. So we could think of, for example, extending some of these tools to offer the ability to do assessment. So you author multiple versions, or the system suggests multiple versions, and then you can deploy them given your intents and the feedback that comes back from your audience. That can help, resolve which design is better, which design is more appropriate given the particular intent. So I think it's doable. I think finding a direct language for expressing intents that is mappable to direct manipulation features is an open problem. I don't know how easy it is to do that, but that's a great future research idea. I'd love to see more of that.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Alex, for specifying your affiliation, University of Washington. I'm sorry, we're running a bit behind on time, so I had a question for you. I've posted it in our chat here. I'd love to talk about it maybe in a later at a later stage. Thanks again for the great presentation. We'll move on to the next one.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you. And everyone in the chat, please, when you ask a question, do you mind adding your affiliation just so that we can say it out loud? Thank you. So the next presentation will be given by Stephen Kazika. Table scraps, an actionable framework for multi-table data wrangling from an artifact study of computational journalism. Over to you, Stephen.
British Columbia. We perform a technical observation study of data wrangling from computational notebooks and scripts written by journalists in the wild. And from this qualitative data, we developed two taxonomies, one of actions taken by journalists and a second of process observations recorded by the research team. We observed many things, the most salient of which was the extent to which journalists use multiple tables in their wrangling environments. This prompted us to reconceptualize wrangling as a multi-table process through our new framework. In this presentation, I'll begin by discussing journalism as a microcosm and then describe our study, our process, details of our two taxonomies, and our multi-table framework. Then I'll conclude with two critical incidents that demonstrate these contributions in action. This is a compelling group through which to study wrangling. Journalists are often cast as a non-technical user group, but a subset of data-literate reporters and editors use many of the tools and techniques common in data science to produce so-called data journalism, and much of their work is the result of extensive data wrangling. Even small articles can require lots of wrangling, and these articles often contain a quote-unquote nerd box, a sidebar or snippet in an article that provides a methodological description and a link to further data reporting materials, such as this piece by BuzzFeed News. The analysis code and raw data for this article is stored on GitHub, and we found hundreds of repos like this one publicly available on the platform. Journalists are encouraged to perform this service for editorial transparency so that the public can scrutinize their analysis and also for colleagues to reproduce their work. Our study looks at what these repos can tell us about how journalists wrangle data. We perform a qualitative study on 50 such repos authored by more than 30 journalists. We find that journalists perform many common wrangling tasks, but the extent to which journalists use multiple tables extends far beyond what we normally consider as data wrangling. Data wrangling has been studied among many groups, including enterprise data analysts, data scientists, but not data journalists, so our study provides a never-before-seen look into the processes of this user group with implications that we anticipate will extend far beyond data journalism. Our process is characterized by the indirect observation of users' technical artifacts, or a technical observation study. So to understand the wrangling practices of these data-literate journalists with programming skills, we conduct this technical observation study in two subphases. First, we systematically select relevant repos from public code repositories, such as GitHub and Observable HQ. Then we perform rounds of iterative qualitative coding, developing open codes from observational data, and categorizing these open codes through axial coding. Along the way, we produce sketches of how data flows from table to table in the wrangling environment, and this gave us a high-level overview of the wrangling process. Out of this, we produce our initial set of taxonomies, our first contribution. To determine which practices align with or diverge from existing characterizations, we search relevant literature to discover gaps in other work and also to harmonize and align our codes with common terminology. We update our taxonomies accordingly. Existing process theories of data wrangling don't adequately capture the expressive ways journalists use multiple tables to wrangle their data. So to recharacterize wrangling to match these observed practices, we reflect on our own work in the context of other work on wrangling multiple tables, thus synthesizing a multi-table framework, our final contribution. Our first contribution is the set of two taxonomies of data wrangling in computational journalism. These taxonomies are cross-cutting, meaning they offer two complementary perspectives on the same phenomena. The actions taxonomy captures wrangling actions taken by journalists, while the process taxonomy records observations of their wrangling process as interpreted by the research team. These taxonomies are descriptive and extensive. While there are only 7 codes at the highest level of each taxonomy, there are 165 total open and axial codes across both. The further one drills down into each taxonomy, the more specific the code. For example, merge captures the highest level action of combining data sets. And within merge, we make the distinction between union, which combines observations similar to a union operation in SQL, and supplement, which combines variables, which is analogous to a join operation in SQL. Within supplement, we make the further distinction between Adar joins, in which observations are retained in only one dataset, and full joins, where observations are retained in both datasets. Within process, we record pain points, where journalists appear to be facing wrangling issues. We notice many issues arising after the merger of two datasets. For example, data was often lost after an Adar join, which we coded in our process taxonomy as a lossy join. Our second and final contribution is our multi-table framework for data wrangling. A key finding from our technical observation study was that journalists use many tables while wrangling data, and this was evident from the complex relationship between table objects depicted in our data flow sketches, where each node represents a table object and each arrow represents a modification to that object. The complexity of journalists' workflows varied greatly. Some were relatively simple linear processes that would still be challenging to implement in many interactive wrangling applications. More complex processes utilize dozens of input sources in a bifurcating process with multiple output files. And the most complex would be daunting to perform in any interactive system. And this prompted us to reconsider how we might characterize wrangling to better match these observed practices, and to address the most complicated workflows, such as this one involving 30 tables from the Washington Post. We approached defining a design space by thinking of wrangling operations as transformation functions defined by two dimensions. The first is the type of object, either tables, rows, or columns. And the second dimension is the cardinality of the function's input and output, either 0, 1, or many objects. The result is a concise and actionable framework for reasoning about wrangling operations, and it covers many familiar ones. For example, filtering can be thought of in our framework as a transformation function that deletes rows. Entity resolution, or the task of reconciling multiple names for the same thing, can be thought of as a one-to-one column transformation. Joins and unions in SQL fit under the combined tables category, but our framework can also speculate about actions not well supported. While there are many invocations of combining tables, the inverse operation, separating tables, is not widely supported. However, we observe journalists performing this frequently. We demonstrate these contributions in action through two critical incidents from our set of 50 coded journalist repos. Our first example is a multi-table success story. In this article, LA Times journalists investigate patterns of water usage after California lifted drought restrictions in 2016. And this article contains two common examples of process codes. First, it contains the kind of analysis that revolves around comparing different groups, in this case, water districts. And second, it uses publicly available open government data, which journalists downloaded from a state website. During the wrangling process, journalists encountered a data set much like this one, that contains water supplier, which roughly corresponds to geographic area, the date, the amount of water used in billions of gallons, and the amount of water used specifically in 2013. While variables in this dataset mostly correspond to table columns, the year variable is actually contained in two columns. The date column contains the month and the year for specific amounts. For example, in August 2015, East Bay used around 6 billion gallons. But values for 2013 are in a separate column. However, they still correspond to the month variable in the date column. So the goal here is to wrangle this data into a partially tidy format, where the year variable is only in the date column. To be truly tidy, however, the date column would have to be separated into month and year columns. And this is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do with only one table. But you can fix this with multiple tables, as these journalists did, using what we called in our process taxonomy as a divide and conquer strategy, where journalists separate one table into many, fix the constituent tables, and then merge them all back together again. But this process is still extremely tedious, even with modern programming libraries such as Pandas and Python. To tackle this challenge, journalists begin by separating this table into three, one for each year, and duplicating 2015 to stand in for 2013. Second, journalists remove unnecessary columns. They retain the 2013 amounts column only in one table. Third, journalists perform two separate one-to-one transformations with columns. They rename columns, trivially a one-to-one transformation, essentially the identity function. And second, they replace 2015 with 2013, since the months are correct. Finally, journalists combine the constituent tables together again, and this produces the end result. Our second and final critical incident is a cautionary tale, illustrating one of the pitfalls of wrangling in a multi-table environment. Using public data from the U.S. State Department, this article by BuzzFeed explores U.S. refugee resettlement data between 2005 and 2015. After aggregating the data by state, the issue that prevents analysis here is that comparisons of raw numbers are biased towards the most populous states. So the wrangling goal here is largely statistical, and journalists address this by bringing in a separate dataset of state population estimates in order to supplement the refugee arrival dataset and calculate a normalized rate of refugee arrival. But these datasets are only partially congruent, unbeknown to the journalists at the time. The refugee table is missing data on Wyoming, since the state has not resettled any refugees during this time period. And when it comes time to combine these two datasets through an outer join, Wyoming is silently dropped, introducing an error. And we code this in our process taxonomy as a pain point, specifically a lossy join, when data is lost as the result of a merge. The news organization was forced to issue a correction shortly after publishing, demonstrating that common issues in data wrangling have real editorial consequences for journalists. In conclusion, our study has two contributions. Two taxonomies, one for actions and one for processes, developed from a qualitative study of journalists' Git repos. And our second contribution is a multi-table framework for data wrangling that addresses major pain points unaddressed in previous work and is both actionable and concise. Please see our paper for further details. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Very, very thorough design study, very interesting work. Thank you.
Thanks.
Looking at the chat, I see you were active a bit in the chat as well. So there's a bit of questioning around how does it call them? The data literate journalists with programming skills species, according to Wolfgang. And so he has a question: which kind of media outlets did the journalists you collaborated with work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of our sampling approach was to survey a bunch of journalists from a vast swath of resources and experiences. So we took articles from like major daily newspapers, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, as well as sort of smaller operations, such as like the NPR affiliate in Florida, to give us a broader scope of the different skills that journalists have. But all of these repos corresponded to articles that were published in sort of print-oriented online journalism.
Thank you. There's another question here that came in from Hans-Peter Pfister from Harvard University. So he did not hear the term critical incident used in the context of the study. He's asking if this is well-established terminology, from what literature?
Yes, so critical incidences, that's a technique that I think comes from interaction design. I think its history sort of comes out of work carried out by the US Army Air Forces, but it's sort of like a way of analyzing this qualitative data that looks for sort of real world examples that are sort of an exemplar of the other observations that you're studying.
Great, thank you. For the sake of time, sorry, we're going to move on to the last presentation, but round of applause as well, or again, at least in the chat I see. Congrats again on the great work. Thank you. So moving on to our last presentation in this session that will be presented by Sheshong Wang. I hope I said that correctly again, sorry. Data comics for reporting controlled user studies in human-computer interaction. Over to you, Sheshong.
Hello, I'm Zerong from University of Edinburgh. Today I'm pleased to introduce our new work, Data Comics for Reporting Controlled User Studies in Human-Computer Interaction. This work won't happen without our excellent collaborators. They are Jacob Ritchie from Stanford University, Jingtao Zhou from Tianjin University, Fanny Chevalier from University of Toronto, and my supervisor Benjamin Bach. With not too much experience of giving scientific presentations, I feel like one mouth is not enough to describe this 9-page condensed report in 12 minutes, especially in a big conference like VIS, where audience are not only domain experts and professionals, but also supermen. You must have more than one brain to keep following and understand every presentation. It's not an easy communication at all, neither by vocal presentation nor written reports. For example, a standard HCI quantitative study begins with context, motivation, then the conditions, hypotheses, tasks, stimuli, materials, then it details participants, study setup, followed by data analysis and result presentation. There are loads of information. So, scientific study reports always have compressed description. Moreover, they are full of domain-specific jargons and complex visualizations. During a communication process, complex relations may not be sufficiently explained, or you may simply overlook crucial information for the results. For example, what do these error bars indicate? A p-value, 95% confidence interval, or 98%? Why do these two charts have different x-axes? Do they present the same things? And what are those transparent bars in this context? If they are not explained in captions, you will need to find them in text. So, the poor exposition, abstractions, and notation like this can add to research debt and create an increasing need for interpretive labor. To make research findings more accessible to both experts and lay audiences, a range of formats have emerged to complement the traditional articles. For example, graphical abstract, posters, videos, interactive explanations. However, the oversimplification can cause important details to be sacrificed, such as concrete descriptions of methods, decisions, and context. So we're looking for something between the complexity and oversimplification to fill the gap. A study we did before have suggested potentials of data comics for data-driven storytelling. Data comics have a great flexibility and numerous characteristics beneficial to communication. That includes a high integration of visual and textual explanations, the sequential presentation of information, visual content for recall and quick navigation, and provide different levels of reading. We focus data comics that are less on cartoons or visual styles, but as a way of thinking, logic, and effective communication technique. In this paper, we aim to provide a framework for researchers and science communicators, guiding the dissemination process and designing visual narratives for scientific study reports. To achieve quick overview as well as access to details from skimming to close reading. We have 5 initial design objectives: clarify decisions and important information, explain information visually, support recognition and recall with a visual vocabulary, provide visual overview and structure, use aesthetic appeal to create engagement. Here's one of our examples, something you can put on your appendix, poster, project website, or blog post. This comic is made for a classic example of controlled user study in visualization. It compares these two techniques in a lab setting. The comic includes 6 stages and follows a linear reading sequence. The context stage begins with an introduction and illustrates the construction of weighted graphs and raises questions that motivate the study. Then at the stage of conditions and the task, it explains conditions of 2 techniques visually. The 3 vertical panels to illustrate the task flow of what users need to pay attention for in the task, what are needed to count, and shows interactions to finish a trail and insert an answer. The 4 hypotheses illustrate the expected results in terms of the dependent variables by using annotated bar chart sketches. This stage includes participant, setup, conditions, and the screenshot of the interface presented to the participants. It uses 4 panels to show the order in which datasets were shown goes from simple to difficult, followed by the results were displayed in a question and answer pattern. Each one declares the winner technique for independent variables, highlights significant findings. The last stage contrasts the initial hypothesis with the findings from the results, and reports which ones are supported or unsupported. This example shows 6 selected stages. We have 10 stages detailed in the paper with more examples. This flowchart shows the methodology of this paper. We started our exploration by creating comics of our own papers that involved empirical studies. We constructed at least 1 complete example comic for each study. It was an iterative process that involved discussions among all authors. We conducted guided design discussion in parallel to our own exploration. 3 participants created data comics for research papers they were familiar with. In the process, participants struggled to decide which parts of analysis should be included into the comic. We analyzed examples produced during our exploration and design discussion, and distilled an initial list of stages with design solutions. Eventually, to further evaluate the idea of using data comics for stages and find more design solutions, we conducted a collaborative design session with 7 researchers from different backgrounds on their own papers. The entire design sessions were conducted individually for each participant. Participants were asked to attend with a write-up of their study and give a brief presentation. Then the instructor briefly introduced the data comics with examples. Participants were then asked to create drafts for their comics offline. We provided textual guidelines for each stage as well as 3 example comics. They worked on their drafts for 1 to 4 days. We met again with each participant, discussing their storyboards and the challenges they had. Then the instructors iterated the comics aided by their written reports as well as feedback from participants by email and calls. Eventually, participants filled the questionnaires about their experience of creation process. The result shows the participants found our examples were well illustrated and they found it was a very good opportunity to create a visual, easy to consume format. Our stages and guidance helped them to distill the required information and structure to follow. But 3 participants reported issues with identifying the target audience and deciding what information should be included, how detailed the comic should be. We also found the most difficulties are with explaining multiple methods, complex stimuli, and explaining data transformation of analysis. With data comics, this paper only focuses on reporting quantitative studies. We have tried a few examples to explain qualitative results, like explaining machine learning models, algorithms, and formulas, but those touch an even bigger design space, which will require more attention in future. To summarize, in this work, we have created an initial set of examples, developed through design exploration and iterated collaborative design. We provide a 10-stage guidelines on what one could do with data comics for reporting controlled user studies. We will update more examples on our website. Our results are at the beginning point of the exploration, and it's still at the very primary stage of a very big design space. Thanks for watching, and I'm happy to take questions and comments from you.
Thank you, Shizhong, for this great work again. I think it's really interesting to see the data comics now applied to scientific communication. There's a lot of reaction to that in the chat as well. There's a call for maybe having a training or tutorial on data comics next year at VIS. I guess it's not really a question, but we have a comment from Natalia Adrienko that you might want to elaborate on, having an automatic generator of data comics. Would you like to say, is this something that you have in mind? Are you thinking about, or?
Yeah, it's really a good idea, I think. Actually, when we try to create the examples, it's very time-consuming process when we collaborate with other, like when we do the co-design with the authors of their paper. I need to like read very thoroughly on their work and understand everything and let them to explain me everything, and then I can do data comics. That's why we have the guidelines, the 10-step guidelines to give people like, okay, this is options. We don't want to standardize like this only way we can do data comics like this, or with this only like templates with people should present their paper. But this is options that people know that, okay, here probably I can use a heat map to present the significant level of comparison, or we can use a randomized plot to show how the randomization, the participant was organized. Yeah, just give these options and hope this work can inspire like more creative ideas.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions coming in. One, so I apologize to the person who asked the question. I'm assuming the name is a pseudonym. This person wonders, what are your thoughts about the comic and playful style, the sort of sketchy rendering? How does this affect the trustworthiness or the perception of worthiness of the controlled experiments results?
Oh yeah, that's a good question actually. So when we say comic, we sometimes thinking that's sketchy things, or it will, you might think like cartoons and it's very like childish things, but actually this is about the style. But for data comics, this is about how to make the message, get the message across, and the logic and the flow of the pipeline of the storyline of your study, or statistical analysis pipeline. And so of course you use different style, and that's for different audience. You make it like very sketchy, probably you want to engage lay audience or engage children, but we also try to use a computer generated graph, which looks very serious, and to make the error point very accurate, and that's, I think, should be good for the scientific communication.
Interesting, yeah, thank you. Maybe one last question that came in from Wolfgang. How long does it take you to create one of these data comics? And maybe I'll spice that one slightly. How did this differ according to the backgrounds of the different researchers that you worked with in the design sessions that you conducted? So how long did it take you to create individual charts? And was there an effect, did it make it more complicated to work, I don't know, with anthropologists versus computer scientists and so on?
Oh yeah, yes, because when we did collaborative design, actually, they are not all of them from HCI, but some of them from like psychology and from some people doing machine learning. Yeah, there's very big design space, so it takes several, like at least 1 week we thought to have a polished work, because during the process we will have like 2 to 3 times of meeting, and during the meeting we will ask the author if I understand your work correctly, and is that interpret in a like proper way. So there are several iterations, and until we can have the very decent work at the end.
Great, thank you very much. I guess it's time to wrap up now. So I guess in the chat, let's just all thank our presenters once more. Unfortunately, we didn't see the very beginning of each of the videos where the names of all the collaborators were mentioned. I won't go through the list of all of them right now, but again, also a round of applause for the presenters and all of their collaborators. Thanks everyone for signing in. I hope you enjoyed the session. I definitely did. Take care and enjoy the rest of VIS. Bye everyone.
Tableau helps you see the stories in your data. It's designed to help you be smarter, so you can make better decisions faster. Connect to the data you care about. Sort, highlight, drill down, or filter your data in seconds. Add calculations to extend your data. With Tableau, you can keep on asking questions in the data until you discover the root cause. Tableau, Answer questions at the speed of thought.
Visualizing the performance progression of machine learning techniques is often achieved by plotting the accuracy in a line chart. For specific tasks such as multi-class classification, they hide important factors such as inter-class confusion and instance-level details. We propose Instance Flow, a tool for interactive visualization of the evolution of classifier confusion on the instance level.
Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. I'm Haekyu Park from Georgia Tech. I'm very excited to present Bluff, a visualization tool to interactively decipher adversarial attacks on deep neural networks. Deep learning is now commonly used in many domains. For example, in the medical field, deep learning models can estimate the treatment effects on patients. On the road, we can see self-driving cars using computer vision technologies. However, deep learning models are vulnerable to adversarial attacks. An adversarial attack applies carefully crafted perturbations on data inputs and fools a model into making incorrect predictions. Adversarial attacks jeopardize many deep learning-based technologies, especially in security and safety-critical applications, such as data-driven healthcare and self-driving cars. Due to the threats of the adversarial attacks, people cannot confidently use deep learning models. To overcome the vulnerability of deep learning models, we need to understand how the adversarial attacks permeate the model's internals. Also, for a better understanding about adversarial attacks, it would be worthwhile to examine if and how an attack strength changes how the model produces incorrect predictions. For example, it would be useful to know if a stronger attack exploits the same neurons as a weaker attack does, or if those sets are completely different. We present Bluff, an interactive visualization tool for discovering and interpreting how adversarial attacks mislead DNN into making incorrect predictions. Our main idea is to visualize activation pathways within a DNN traversed by the signals of input data. For given input data, an activation pathways consist of neurons that are highly activated and the most influential paths. Activation pathways represent what features are detected and how those features are related to contribute to the final prediction. To understand how the attacks manipulate the neurons and the paths inside the models, Bluff visualizes the activation pathways of both benign inputs and attacked inputs. That is, Bluff finds and visualizes the most activated pathways given benign and attacked input data. Bluff also visualizes the most inhibited paths by the attack to uncover where the attack is blocking the signals to the benign path. Also, Bluff visualizes the most excited paths by the attack to uncover where the attack stimulates to induce the activation pathways going towards wrong directions. The Bluff interface tightly integrates three coordinate views. It consists of control sidebar, graph summary view, and detail view. Here, a user inspects why a deep learning model misclassifies adversarial giant peta images crafted by the projected gradient descent attack as armadillo. In the main graph summary view, we visualize the activation pathways of benign and attacked input data. Here, each vertex represents a neuron. When hovering over a neuron, Bluff shows the detailed information of the neuron. The detailed view for a neuron shows a feature visualization and example data that visualize what feature the neuron is detecting. For example, for giant panda images, this neuron looks for face of animals that have white furs and dark eyes. Feature visualization is a synthesized image that maximizes the corresponding neuron's activation. Dataset examples are patches of images from the training data that highly activate the corresponding neurons. We also show how the neuron's median activation would change according to different attack strengths. Here in the graph summary view, the neurons are represented with different colors based on their roles. The green nodes are the most important neurons only for the original class, giant panda, which means they are highly activated by benign giant panda images. The blue nodes are important neurons only for the target class, armadillo. The orange nodes are the most important neurons for both original and target classes, giant panda and armadillo. The red nodes are the neurons that are highly activated by only successfully attacked images. These neurons are exploited by the attack to induce the incorrect prediction. By exploring the activation pathways, PGD successfully perturbed pixels to induce the brown bird features, an appearance more likely shared by an armadillo than a panda. Both armadillo and brown birds have small, roundish, and brown bodies. The brown bird neuron then contributes to the armadillo misclassification by activating more features such as scales, bumps, and mesh. By using the options in the control sidebar, users can interactively filter the neurons and connections to visualize. For example, they can select to visualize R graph, or only highlighted neurons, or only pinned neurons. By using the highlight pathways options, users can select which activation pathways to visualize, such as most activated or most inhibited, excited, or most changed by the attack. By using the comparison mode, users can compare how attacks of different strengths have different activation pathways. In summary, we developed Bluff, an interactive system to understand how adversarial perturbations flow of deep learning model. Bluff visualizes most activated, inhibited, excited activation pathways after the attacks, and provides flexible comparison of attack escalation. Thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Many techniques can be used to render and visually explore large 3D line sets,